Sarah was the devoted wife, Michael was the hard-working husband, and Ethan was the neighbor's son who should have been just a friend, but when Forbidden's desires crossed the line, their lives collided in a shocking crime no one saw coming. Clara was known by everyone in her neighborhood as a calm and well-kept woman who never stirred trouble. Her husband Martin had been with her for 15 years, and to most people they looked like a reliable couple who had built a steady life together. They lived in a modest house at the end of a suburban street where the lawns were neatly trimmed and the driveways were always filled with cars that rarely moved. The neighbors saw them as dependable, a couple who waved politely, attended community gatherings when they could, and minded their own business. But behind the closed doors of their home, Clara carried a restlessness that no one else could see. The long hours Martin spent at the factory left her isolated, and she often found herself pacing from room to room, unsettled, as though something essential in her life had gone missing. The silence of the house became heavy, and she began to crave something that could stir the monotony she felt trapped in. Martin was not cruel, nor was he distant by choice. His job demanded grueling hours, and his sense of responsibility kept him chained to it. He returned home each evening exhausted, with little energy left for conversation, intimacy, or shared moments. Clara told herself it was temporary, that the sacrifices were for the greater good of their future, but the months dragged on and her feelings of neglect deepened. She started noticing things she had once ignored, the way other women in the neighborhood smiled with their husbands, the casual laughter of couples walking hand in hand, and the small touches exchanged in public. These sights gnawed at her, making her feel like she was missing out on a life she should have been living. When Ryan returned home from college for the summer, Clara's restless thoughts found a dangerous outlet. Ryan was the neighbor's son, a young man just stepping into adulthood. He carried himself with the carefree energy of someone unburdened by responsibility, and his presence on the street did not go unnoticed. He spent his days jogging, fixing his car, or casually chatting with neighbors as he passed by. Clara had watched him grow up over the years, but this time was different. He was no longer a child, but a young man full of confidence, curiosity, and vitality. She caught herself watching him longer than she should, lingering at the window when he was outside. At first, she told herself it was harmless. She was simply observing, filling her time with distractions. But the truth was far darker than she wanted to admit. Their first real moment of connection happened by chance. Clara was bringing groceries inside when Ryan offered to help carry the heavier bags. It was a small gesture, nothing out of the ordinary, but when their hands brushed against each other, something inside her stirred. That spark of contact, so minor to him, felt electric to her. The loneliness she had endured for months made the attention feel intoxicating. Over the following days, Clara found herself inventing reasons to cross paths with him. She lingered longer in the yard, struck up conversations about trivial things, and offered him drinks when the summer heat grew unbearable. Ryan, oblivious to the deeper implications, seemed flattered by the attention, and the casual exchanges became more frequent. The secrecy of it all added fuel to Clara's feelings. She knew Martin trusted her completely, and the neighbors would never suspect her of anything inappropriate. That sense of invisibility gave her courage. She began dressing more carefully when she knew Ryan would be outside, taking extra time with her hair or choosing clothes that highlighted her figure. Her actions were subtle enough to escape suspicion, but in her mind each choice was deliberate. She was luring him closer, testing the boundaries of what she could get away with. The guilt was there, faint but persistent, yet it was always drowned out by the thrill. The affair did not begin with a dramatic declaration, but with a series of small steps that blurred the line between friendliness and something much more dangerous. Clara invited Ryan inside one afternoon when the sun was scorching, offering him lemonade. Their conversation flowed easily, and she noticed how his laughter filled the silence of the house in a way Martin's weary voice no longer did. She leaned into the sound, soaking it up like someone starved for affection. When he left that day, she felt a rush of excitement that refused to fade. She spent the night replaying their interaction, convincing herself that it was innocent while secretly wishing for more. Over the following weeks, Clara's behavior shifted in subtle but telling ways. She became more energized, more alive, as though a hidden part of her had been reawakened. Martin noticed her improved mood but assumed it was due to the summer weather or a new hobby. He was too tired to question it, too blind to see what was right in front of him. Clara, emboldened by his ignorance, grew reckless. She timed Ryan's jogs, made sure she was outside when he passed, and found reasons to invite him in when Martin wasn't home. Each interaction edged them closer to something irreversible. The neighborhood itself seemed to conspire in keeping their secret. People were accustomed to seeing Ryan move between houses, offering help or running errands, so his presence at Clara's door never raised alarms. The trust between families, built over years of shared holidays and borrowed tools, worked in Clara's favor. No one thought twice about a young man visiting a married woman. It was simply how the community functioned. But beneath that normalcy, Clara knew she was constructing a fragile web of lies. One wrong move, one careless gesture, could unravel everything. The risk only heightened her desire, pushing her further down a path she could no longer control. As the days grew longer and the summer heat intensified, so did the tension between them. Clara's longing was no longer confined to fleeting moments or innocent touches. It burned stronger each day, demanding more, daring her to cross a line she once thought impossible. She felt both terrified and exhilarated, caught between the fear of being discovered and the hunger to satisfy what she craved. What she did not realize was that every choice she made, every glance, every calculated encounter, was leading her closer to disaster. The peaceful street that had always seemed so safe would soon become the stage for betrayal, violence, and heartbreak. And while Clara told herself she could control the secret, the truth was that secrets in small neighborhoods rarely stayed buried for long. Clara's secret life with Ryan took on a rhythm that felt intoxicating. The affair grew in the quiet shadows of the neighborhood, hidden behind blinds and whispered by glances. What began as small favors and casual visits turned into dangerous patterns that Clara convinced herself were harmless. She told herself she was just filling an emotional void, a gap left by Martin's constant exhaustion and long hours at the factory. But deep down, she knew the truth was darker. It wasn't just attention she craved. It was the thrill of doing something forbidden, of holding a secret so sharp it could cut her life apart if it slipped from her hands. Afternoons became the most dangerous time. Martin's shifts often stretched into the evening, leaving the house empty except for Clara. She began inviting Ryan over more frequently, sometimes under the excuse of helping her fix small things around the house. He replaced light bulbs, carried boxes, and once even trimmed the bushes in the yard while Clara watched him from the kitchen window. Every moment he spent near her made the air feel charged, and the ordinary rooms of her home transformed into stages for temptation. She thought she was careful, lowering her voice when neighbors walked by and making sure doors were closed. But no matter how cautious she was, the very nature of the secret made it fragile. One slip, one watchful eye could destroy everything. Clara told herself that no one was paying attention. The neighborhood trusted her, and Ryan was young enough that people brushed off his presence as normal. But whispers had already begun. A few neighbors had noticed how often he went into her house when Martin was away. They talked quietly over fences and during evening walks, never loud enough to reach Clara's ears, but the suspicion was spreading. Some told themselves it was nothing, that Clara was just lonely and Ryan was being helpful. Others were less forgiving, convinced they were watching a scandal unfold in real time. Inside the house, Clara let herself indulge in the feeling of being wanted again. Ryan's attention reignited parts of her that had been dormant for years. She dressed differently, choosing clothes that accentuated her figure and spending more time in front of the mirror before he came over. She bought scented candles she never used with Martin, and she began keeping her phone close, checking it constantly as though she was waiting for a message that might never come. Every knock on the door, every step on the porch, made her heart race with anticipation. Ryan, for his part, was flattered by the attention of an older woman. He didn't think of it as dangerous the way Clara did. To him, it was an adventure, something to brag about privately in his head but never out loud. He enjoyed the secrecy but didn't understand the risk. Clara, however, understood all too well. She felt the weight of the danger pressing on her every time she heard Martin's key in the door at night. She smiled and played the part of a devoted wife, all the while hiding the guilt that coiled inside her. But instead of pulling back, the danger made her reckless. The summer heat only heightened the tension. Long days stretched into nights filled with restlessness. Clara found excuses to see Ryan almost daily. She asked for help with groceries, invited him to swim in their backyard pool when no one else was around, and sometimes simply called him over for a drink when she felt lonely. Their interactions became less about chance and more about design. She planned them, orchestrated them like a dangerous game she couldn't stop playing. Martin, meanwhile, remained blind to the truth. His job consumed his energy, leaving him too tired to notice the changes in his wife. He saw her in brighter moods, noticed she had a glow about her he hadn't seen in years, and assumed it was because she was finding new ways to occupy her time. He felt relieved, even grateful, believing that she was happy despite his absence. He never questioned the sudden improvements, the new clothes, or the candles she lit around the house. For him, it was easier to accept the illusion than to search for what might be lurking beneath it. But the illusion couldn't last forever. One late afternoon, as Ryan left Clara's house, a neighbor across the street noticed. The sight of him slipping out while Martin was still at work made the neighbor uneasy. It wasn't the first time, and this time it was too blatant to ignore. The whispers grew louder in private conversations, but no one had the courage to confront Clara directly. They told themselves it wasn't their business, even though they watched the pieces fall into place. The neighborhood was beginning to turn into an audience, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Inside her mind, Clara felt untouchable. She believed she had control over the situation, convincing herself that no one could connect the dots. She saw Ryan as her escape, the antidote to her loneliness, and she pushed aside the gnawing voice of guilt. She told herself Martin would never find out, that as long as she was careful, her secret would stay buried. But the cracks were already spreading. The thrill of the affair blinded her to the small mistakes she made, leaving Ryan's belongings behind, lingering too long at the window, or smiling a little too brightly when his name came up in conversation. These details, minor as they seemed, were seeds of suspicion waiting to bloom. The deeper Clara went, the less she thought about consequences. She stopped worrying about what might happen if Martin discovered the truth, focusing instead on how the secret made her feel alive again. But beneath the excitement, danger was building. Martin's exhaustion was not permanent. One unexpected moment, one unplanned return, could unravel everything. Clara didn't realize how close that moment already was, and how her carefully balanced secret was about to collapse into something far more destructive than she could imagine. The neighborhood's quiet calm hid the truth like a curtain, but behind it, betrayal was spreading like fire. Clara's choices were shaping a future she hadn't considered. She thought she was playing a game she could control, but every affair is a gamble, and her time was running out. What had started as a small thrill was becoming something much more dangerous, and soon the shadows she lived in would no longer be enough to hide what she had done. Martin had always trusted Clara without question. For 15 years he had come home from long shifts at the factory believing his wife would always be there, faithful and loyal, waiting to share the quiet evenings they had built together. But that trust began to erode slowly, eaten away by details he couldn't explain. At first it was small things, easy to dismiss. A shirt that wasn't his folded on the couch. The faint smell of cologne in the living room that didn't belong to him. Clara's nervous laugh when he asked what she had done that day. These moments should have slipped past unnoticed, but once Martin's suspicion was awakened, he couldn't stop himself from seeing patterns everywhere. One evening he returned home earlier than usual, his muscles aching from the factory but his mind sharper than it had been in weeks. The first thing he noticed was the hurried way Clara met him at the door. She seemed startled, as if she hadn't expected him so soon. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed. Martin said nothing, but his stomach tightened as his eyes drifted to the coffee table. 2 glasses sat there, both half full, one with lipstick smudged across the rim and the other with no trace of use. He asked no questions, choosing instead to keep his thoughts buried deep. But as the night wore on, the unease clawed at him. In the following days, Martin began watching more closely. He noticed that Clara had developed new habits. She spent more time getting ready during the day, her clothes brighter, Her makeup applied even when she had no plans to leave the house. She hummed while she worked around the kitchen, a sound he hadn't heard in years. At first, he wanted to believe it was because she was happy again, maybe rediscovering her old self. But the changes didn't feel natural. They felt forced, like someone trying too hard to hide something. Then came the day when Martin saw Ryan leaving their home. It was mid-afternoon and Martin had left work early after a machine broke down at the factory. He pulled into the driveway quietly, not wanting to draw attention. That was when he saw Ryan, the neighbor's son, slipping out of the side door of the house. The young man glanced around nervously before walking quickly across the yard toward his family's home. For a moment, Martin froze, unable to process what he was seeing. The image burned into his mind, clear and undeniable. His chest tightened as the realization struck him. Clara wasn't just restless or distant. She was betraying him with the boy he had watched grow up next door. Martin didn't storm inside or shout. He kept his silence, but his mind twisted in ways he had never experienced before. Betrayal, humiliation, rage, each emotion collided inside him until he felt like a stranger in his own body. That night, Clara acted as though nothing had happened, preparing dinner and asking about his day. Martin responded with short answers, watching her carefully, memorizing her every move. He wanted proof beyond doubt, evidence he could hold in his hands before unleashing the fury building inside him. Over the next week, Martin began his own quiet investigation. He left work at unexpected times, circling back home without warning, always careful not to be seen. He studied the rhythms of Clara's days, the times when she went out or when Ryan came by. He noticed how the curtains in the living room were drawn shut during afternoons, though Clara had always preferred natural light. He noticed how quickly she hung up the phone when he entered the room, and how her eyes darted toward the clock as if counting the minutes until he left again. The signs were everywhere, and each one felt like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. The neighborhood, too, was not blind. Martin began to sense the glances from neighbors, the way conversations hushed when he walked by. Though no one dared speak the truth aloud, the whispers were already circulating. He could feel the weight of their pity pressing down on him, as if everyone knew what he had yet to confront directly. The shame gnawed at him, harder than the betrayal itself. Inside his mind, Martin constructed scenes he couldn't erase. He pictured Clara and Ryan together in the very rooms he came home to every night. He imagined their laughter, their whispers, their hands on one another. The thoughts tormented him until sleep became impossible. He lay awake at night beside Clara, staring at the ceiling while she slept peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing next to her. His anger transformed into something darker, an obsession with reclaiming control over the life he felt slipping through his hands. Instead of confronting her immediately, Martin decided to wait. He wanted Clara to think he was oblivious, to continue her game while he prepared his response. He believed that silence would give him power, that by pretending not to know, he could gather more evidence and strike when the moment was right. But the longer he waited, the more the rage inside him grew. Every touch from her felt like poison. Every smile felt like mockery. He could no longer see the woman he married, only the image of her betrayal. The final confirmation came one night when Martin returned home and found a small gold chain on the bedroom floor. It wasn't Clara's, nor was it his. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to Ryan, something he had seen the boy wear for years. Holding it in his hand, Martin felt the last thread of denial snap. There was no longer any room for doubt. Clara had brought her affair into the heart of their home, and Ryan had left behind the evidence with careless arrogance. Martin's silence became dangerous. He stopped speaking more than a few words at a time, moving through the house like a shadow. Clara noticed his coldness but misinterpreted it as fatigue or stress. She had no idea that he knew, that each night he was rehearsing what he would do when he finally confronted her. In Martin's mind, betrayal was not something to be forgiven. It was something that demanded punishment, something that could only be answered with action. The house that once held ordinary routines was now filled with tension so thick it seemed ready to shatter at any moment. Martin walked through the rooms with clenched fists, his thoughts consumed by betrayal. Clara, blinded by her reckless desire, continued her affair without realizing that every step she took brought her closer to the edge of disaster. The stage was set, and Martin's fury was no longer something he could contain. The question was not if he would act, but when. The tension in Martin's house had grown unbearable. Days passed in silence, each one heavier than the last. Clara noticed her husband's distant stares and the way he avoided her touch, but she chose to ignore it, convincing herself he was only worn down from work. She did not realize that behind his blank eyes, Martin's mind was spiraling into a storm of anger and obsession. He had stopped seeing her as his wife and had begun to see her as a traitor, someone who had mocked his loyalty and dragged his name into the dirt. Every time he looked at her, he imagined her with Ryan, and the images in his head became darker with every passing night. Martin's patience snapped one evening when he came home earlier than Clara expected. He walked in through the side door, moving quietly, and heard muffled sounds from the living room. When he stepped inside, he froze. Clara was there, her face flushed, and Ryan was standing close enough that there was no mistaking what had been happening. The sight made Martin's vision blur with rage. Ryan bolted, escaping out the back door like a coward, leaving Clara trembling in shock. Martin's eyes fixed on her, and for the first time in 15 years of marriage, she saw a look in him that terrified her. It was not disappointment, not sadness, but something cold and merciless. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Martin's voice, sharp and trembling with rage, echoed through the house. Clara tried to speak, tried to explain, but her words only fueled his fury. He accused her of betrayal, of humiliating him not only as a husband, but as a man in front of the entire neighborhood. Clara reached out, desperate to calm him, but he shoved her away, his hands shaking as he paced the room. Years of sacrifice, long hours of labor, and trust built over a decade and a half seemed worthless in that moment. All he could see was her betrayal and Ryan's smug youth, intertwined in his mind like a wound that would never heal. As Clara pleaded, Martin's rage erupted into violence. The emotions he had bottled up burst forth uncontrollably. He struck out, his anger manifesting in blows that he barely recognized as his own. Clara cried out, but the sound only echoed through the walls of a house that once held laughter. The neighbors, already suspicious of the strange tension in the couple's lives, heard the noise. Curtains twitched, lights flickered on, and whispers spread through the quiet street. But no one dared intervene. Behind those walls, the storm had broken, and Clara was trapped in it. When Martin's fury subsided for a brief moment, he realized Clara was on the floor, bruised and broken. His chest heaved and sweat poured down his face. Yet his anger had not burned out. Instead it shifted, focusing on Ryan. To Martin, Clara was guilty, but Ryan was the catalyst, the intruder who had crossed a sacred boundary. In Martin's eyes, Ryan was not just a foolish young man. He was a thief who had stolen his dignity and invaded his home. The thought of Ryan walking free while he stood humiliated was unbearable. Fueled by that rage, Martin made a plan in the heat of the moment. He knew Ryan would not hide forever. The boy lived just across the street, his presence a constant reminder of everything Martin had lost. Martin's fury sharpened into resolve. That night, after leaving Clara trembling in shock, he stepped into the darkness and crossed the street. He knocked on the neighbor's door, his tone calm, his face collected. He asked to speak with Ryan privately, claiming it was about something important. The parents, unaware of the chaos unfolding, allowed it, and Ryan hesitantly followed Martin outside. The walk was silent, but the air between them was thick with menace. Martin led Ryan to a secluded corner near the garages, away from prying eyes. Ryan tried to speak, but Martin's expression silenced him. The rage that had been building for weeks now erupted with brutal force. Martin attacked without hesitation, striking Ryan with the strength of a man consumed by betrayal. Ryan fought back, but he was no match for Martin's fury. The assault was swift and merciless, leaving Ryan bloodied and gasping on the ground. The noise drew attention. A neighbor stepped outside, saw the struggle, and shouted for help. Within moments, chaos replaced the quiet night. Lights snapped on across the street and voices filled the air. Someone called the police, but by the time sirens approached, the damage was done. Ryan was left broken and barely conscious, his body scarred with wounds he would carry for the rest of his life. Martin stood over him, his hands trembling, his face twisted with the satisfaction of vengeance. For the first time since the suspicion began, he felt a twisted sense of control. When the police arrived, the scene was already surrounded by neighbors. Clara stood on the porch, her face pale, her body shaking as she watched the nightmare unfold. The officers rushed to separate Martin from Ryan, forcing him to the ground and restraining him. The neighbors whispered among themselves, horrified but not surprised. Many of them had seen the affair brewing, had guessed at the secret glances and hidden meetings. But none of them expected it to end in such violence, with police lights painting the street in flashes of red and blue. Clara was questioned, her voice unsteady as she tried to piece together what had just happened. She knew she had been reckless, blinded by her loneliness and the thrill of secrecy. But in that moment, none of her excuses mattered. Her decisions had ignited a chain of destruction that could not be undone. She watched as Martin was led away in handcuffs, his eyes fixed on her with a coldness that pierced through her soul. Ryan was rushed to the hospital, his condition critical but not fatal. His parents wept, torn between fury at Martin and the shame of their son's role in the tragedy. The neighborhood, once a place of safety and trust, now stood as the backdrop to betrayal, violence, and heartbreak. The street where children once played freely was now remembered for flashing lights, blood on the pavement, and the shattering of a family that had seemed untouchable. In that single night, Clara's double life collapsed completely. The affair she thought she could control had destroyed everything: her marriage, her safety, her reputation, and her future. Martin's anger, once hidden beneath exhaustion, had consumed him until there was nothing left but violence. The perfect mask of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by the raw truth of what secrets can do when left to fester in silence. The home that once stood as a symbol of stability now carried the memory of betrayal and bloodshed. No matter what happened next, the damage was permanent, and the lives intertwined in this tragedy would never return to what they once were. The path Clara had chosen out of restlessness and desire had led her, Martin and Ryan, into darkness, and there was no escape from the consequences that followed. The investigation dragged on for weeks, leaving the small community in a cloud of uncertainty. Detectives pieced together the story of the hidden affair and the violent climax that had ended in death, but every detail uncovered only made the case more disturbing. The neighbors, once a tight-knit group, were now divided. Some whispered about Sarah's betrayal, while others pointed to Michael's temper and inability to control his rage. Ethan's role in the entire ordeal was debated endlessly. Was he a manipulator who had pulled Sarah into a dangerous trap, or was he a reckless young man who had underestimated the consequences of his actions? What made the story even darker was the secrecy that surrounded it. Many of Sarah's friends admitted later that they had suspected something unusual in her behavior, yet no one spoke up. Small signs like her sudden changes in mood, her obsession with her appearance, and her restless energy were overlooked. When the truth was finally laid bare, it felt like a tragedy that might have been prevented had someone intervened earlier. The trial that followed became one of the most talked about events in the area. Prosecutors painted Michael as a man driven by blind rage, someone who lost control after discovering his wife's betrayal. The defense, however, tried to cast doubt on the timeline, suggesting that Sarah's death might not have been as straightforward as it seemed. Some experts testified that her injuries did not match Michael's account, fueling rumors that perhaps Ethan had a hand in her final moments. Ethan himself testified, his words carefully chosen, his face pale with fear. He admitted the affair but denied any involvement in the murder. His testimony was filled with contradictions, raising suspicion but not enough to convict him. The trial ended with Michael receiving a life sentence while Ethan walked free. Still, the verdict did not bring peace. The case remained tangled in unanswered questions, leaving both families shattered. After the sentencing, Ethan's life spiraled into isolation. He became an outcast in the community, with whispers following him wherever he went. His parents, once proud of their son, could barely hold their heads up in public. Though he was legally free, the weight of the scandal clung to him. He dropped out of school, distanced himself from friends, and eventually disappeared from the town altogether. Sarah's family lived with grief, haunted by the way she died and the shame that followed her name. They avoided the subject whenever possible, trying to protect the children from the painful truth. The house where the tragedy occurred was eventually sold, but locals claimed strange things happened there. Some spoke of lights flickering late at night, others swore they heard faint cries echoing through the halls. Whether it was imagination or something darker, the house remained a reminder of the crime that had destroyed so many lives. Michael adjusted to prison life, though he never showed remorse. He wrote letters to his children, claiming he only acted out of pain and betrayal. Those letters were rarely answered. The children grew up with the shadow of their family's tragedy following them, each struggling in their own way to escape the legacy of what had happened. The story of Sarah, Michael, and Ethan became a cautionary tale passed around for years, a grim reminder of how secrets and forbidden desires could turn deadly. The case faded from headlines, but never from the memories of those who lived through it. Even years later, old neighbors would recall the day police cars filled the quiet street, breaking the illusion of safety they had once taken for granted. The story was retold countless times, each version slightly different, but the heart of it always the same. A wife crossed a dangerous line, a husband's anger boiled over, and a young man's life was forever stained by scandal. It was a tragedy with no true justice, no real closure, only broken families and unanswered questions left behind. As time passed, the tragedy became almost legend in the area, the kind of story that older generations would whisper to warn the young about the dangers of temptation and betrayal. Some viewed it as a tale of passion gone wrong, others as a harsh lesson about the destructive force of secrets. But for those who had known Sarah, Michael, or Ethan, it was far more than a story. It was a wound that never healed, a reminder that beneath the quiet surface of ordinary lives, darkness can lurk, waiting for the moment to strike. And when it does, it leaves nothing but pain, regret, and broken pieces that can never be put back together again.